My name is Maurice Golden. I'm the Shadow Cabinet Secretary for Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform, which is the longest job title I've ever had. And this event is hosted by Scotland's Futures Forum, which is the Scottish Parliament's Futures think tank. It creates opportunities for MSPs, key stakeholders and others to think long-term about the future, about challenges and opportunities. And the partner for tonight's event is Edinburgh Hub of the Global Shapers community, an initiative of the World Economic Forum. The Edinburgh Hub brings together a community of young leaders, which you can see all around me, to generate solutions that maximise social impact. And I'm delighted to welcome so many of you here tonight. This discussion also forms part of Scotland 2030 programme, which is the Scotland Futures Forum major programme for this parliamentary session. But don't worry, we're not constrained around that date. We can think even far longer term than that. In addition to the panellists, which I'll come to shortly, I'd also like to welcome Maureen Watt MSP and Claudia Beamish MSP as well. The focus of tonight's discussion is around carbon positive jobs for the future. We know that the future is going to be disrupted by automation, artificial intelligence, perhaps increasing hollowing out of the job market. And the challenge for us is to not only adequately deal with all those forces in a just manner, it's also to proactively combat and tackle climate change. One of the greatest challenges we face globally, and to do that in very short shrift, in a quick fashion, while ultimately protecting jobs, creating more new jobs, and making sure that both business, the third sector, and the public sector operate in a manner that fosters and creates all those opportunities. And to consider those questions and others, we have Theresa Bray, who's Chief Executive of ChangeWorks, Georgia Stewart, who's Chief Executive and co-founder of the ethical finance company Tumelo, and Dr. Simon Shackley, who's a lecturer in climate policy at the University of Edinburgh. And each of the panellists will speak for about 10 minutes on their thoughts about the future, and after that we'll open up discussions from everyone around tonight. So, first of all, we'll hear from Theresa Bray. Theresa is Chief Executive of ChangeWorks, which is a social enterprise that advises individuals and organisations on how to reduce their impact on the environment. Yeah, they just do lots of good stuff, and they're doing more good stuff year on year, and that's great to see. Theresa is an accountant by trade with more than 30 years' experience in the voluntary sector, and we look forward to hearing your views on where the future might take us. Theresa.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me along. When we're looking to Scotland in 2030, we're not going to have all our jobs going to be carbon positive. It's not till 2045 that in Scotland we're aiming to be carbon positive, though by 2030 we will be seeing 75% in reducing our emissions. If I think ahead to 2045, what I am concerned about is who's going to be looking after me in my care home. If I go the same way as my mother, I might be in the early stages of Alzheimer's and need some extra care. So I think one of the great issues is going to be how do you make those jobs looking after people, which is not going to disappear anytime soon. Yes, there's a role for automation, but people need interactions with people to a large extent. I'm much clearer, I'm not a futurologist, so knowing what jobs are going to be there is not, I'm not clear on. I am quite clear on what jobs are needed in the next 10 years to take us to be on our journey to be net carbon positive. There's huge amounts of work that is needed to be done in terms of energy efficiency. And I'm afraid that is the sort of jobs which often in Britain people are not so keen to do. It's what we need are skilled plasterers, joiners, and craftspeople to actually work in buildings. And a lot of the people who we have working on site, doing external wall projects, are people from the European Union. And one of our real concerns is, how are we going to staff those jobs in the way going forward? I think one of the things we've got to look at is the building trade needs some entrepreneurs, some different ways of looking at things. How can you be progressing to have off-site construction so that you're not disrupting people to a huge extent? To use some of the technologies, if we've got to fit millions of air source heat pumps, how can you do that with the minimum of disruption in people's homes? I was recently went round Mitsubishi, who make air source heat pumps in Livingston, and they now have, you get a unit which has got your air source heat pumps and all most of the plumbing there. That you only have to have 4 connections to your radiators to actually fix it in. It's those sorts of innovations in the way we produce goods that is going to be very important. So it's thinking of different ways of how you actually work in people's homes is going to be very important. There's definitely the opportunity for new entrants into the market there. Our energy is going to be very different. We've already seen the great change from having 30 large generating assets, big power stations, coal-fired power stations or gas-fired power stations, or a handful of nuclear power stations delivering our energy. We're going to be having very dispersed energy generation and energy storage. The technicalities associated with that, to actually move our grid to the new structures and to actually work out how we monetize the benefit of energy storage, how you use your electric cars to actually, as a storage element, just as the actual mobile element of it, being a car, is probably going to be one of the minor roles for your electric cars. So there is a lot of innovation required in those areas, new approaches to it, and that certainly we are working with some of the aggregators thinking about it, but the national grid is calling out for new engineers and approaches. For a long time, the distribution network was very staid and solid, and they haven't had new people coming in for a long time, and suddenly they're going to have a whole new approach to how you manage distribution network, with people generating their own electricity, storing their own electricity, but yet dependent on the grid as well in times when there's no sun, no wind that they're able to generate locally. Our land use is going to be different. How are we going to continue to both grow our food, but also to use our land as a means of carbon storage? Whether it's peatlands or forestry, we are going to have people planting trees. There are going to be millions and millions of trees that are required. Yes, you get quite smart machines for planting trees, but you're going to have to be able to operate those. So that is a way of use there. And again, that's an area where you're probably needing some new companies coming in. Transport is going to be a huge difference for us. Already we're seeing a lot of people who live in cities, there's no point in owning cars. Certainly my daughter who lives in Glasgow went through the process. She much prefers just using the local, I can't remember, the City Car Club, I can't remember what it's called in Glasgow. And she borrows a car when she does it. She likes the electric car that's there. There's going to be more and more of how can you make those transport choices work smartly for people? What additional information is required so people can use that? How can you move away from fixed bus routes to people to being able to move more efficiently? But we've also got to change how people are living. And the thoughts we already see one of the areas that's been recommended is looking at our diet, reducing the numbers of days that we're eating meat. Behaviour change specialists, influencers, how do you change that demand? How do you change the supermarkets to actually fit in with those requirements? So a lot of thoughts got to go in there. Similarly, in emissions, how do they reduce their emissions? New ways of doing things. So technology does have to keep pace with it. To go alongside that, you need people who don't have those specialist qualifications, but whether they're policymakers or planners, project managers, marketeers, data specialists and software developers, and most importantly, people who can engage with people is going to be a really important part of our future. But I'd like to finish to say, actually, you do have, I don't know what the jobs are going to be there, but you have a lot. You do have some agency about where you work and what companies are there as well. You can apply your own values to your work. You can decide to seek to impact your employer. As employees, there's going to be more and more demand for able employees. You do have an impact on your employer. You've got to think, how do you use your voice? You've got to be prepared to change jobs sometimes as well. You've got a set of skills. Are you applying those in an area that fits with your values? And one of the difficult things can be is, how do you balance doing something that you may love doing or enjoy doing with something that fit with your values? It doesn't always marry up, and you've got to decide where is that balance that's required. A lot of the jobs are actually things driven by your demand as well. How are you consuming things? Are you actually encouraging a whole set of jobs which are not necessarily that rewarding and satisfactory jobs? You see the growth of Amazon and the last mile delivery in areas such as the people delivering homes. We all have responsibility for actually how rubbish a lot of those jobs are, that the people are on 0-hour contracts, we're always driving down those prices. But it's us as consumers who's often driving that. Yes, it may be Amazon is the key prime mover in that, but we are supporting a lot of those companies. We are expecting to pay actually below the reasonable value for those services. We've got to decide as consumers what jobs we want to support or what jobs we want to consider. It's not always possible for us to choose our jobs. A lot of people have got a certain set of skills, limited skills, or are living in a certain area and can't move to other places. And we've got to think how we can provide worthwhile livelihoods for those people, to upskill them, to allow them to retrain, recognising there are going to have to be some big changes, particularly in the oil and gas industry. There may be some jobs in carbon capture and storage, but it won't be to the same level. So how can we provide just transitions for those people? It's going to be a really important area. We've got to make it worthwhile that jobs are an important part of people's life and ensure that they're able to contribute to that wider society. So I think I'll just leave it at that and pass you on to some other people.
Thank you. It was great to hear, and I look forward to exploring some of those issues in a little more detail. Our next talk is from Georgia Stewart from Tumelo, and Georgia can share her experience of how cutting-edge innovation is reshaping our economy.
Can I? Okay. Well, hi everyone. My name's Georgia, and as you said, I am the CEO and co-founder of a company called Tumelo. I'll just tell you a bit about what we do to give you an idea of where I'm coming from, and then I can probably less succinctly tell you about my views on carbon positive jobs in 2030. So Tumelo, as I said, is an impact-focused financial technology startup. We help retail investors and pension members, so normal people on the street who are trying to save for the future, to engage with their investments. And by engage, we mean give people visibility, so help them understand when they have a pension or they have an investment portfolio, what companies they're actually investing in, and also to help give them a voice as a shareholder. So when you buy shares on the stock market, more often than not nowadays, due to automation and AI, you are buying shares indirectly, which means that you don't have the right to vote verbatim. And so what we do is we connect you with the person who does have the right to vote, normally a fund manager sitting closer to those companies you're investing in, and we give them we can empower your voice so that they can hear it when making that decision and vote much more in line with the values of the people whose money is actually funding the investment. So examples of those votes might be voting on a gender equality resolution at Microsoft, or voting Shell to disclose their carbon metrics, or voting for ExxonMobil to target a more aggressive climate strategy by 2030. So really important stuff. And if you're looking at the pension industry in the UK, it's worth £2.4 trillion. So if we can get pension members alone waking up and thinking more about what their money's doing whilst they sleep, then there's massive potential to make impact in that space. So that's what our company does. And I guess then in terms of jobs for 2030, it's true that things are being automated and that AI is going to be influential in terms of the jobs that exist in the future. And lots of jobs that are narrow or kind of like process-driven at the moment, that's the type of job that could be replaced by automation, for example. And obviously by the Sustainable Development Goals, we're aiming to have achieved them by 2030, but I expect that we'll still be dealing with problems like climate change and zero poverty and gender equality. So a lot of those problems will still exist, and that's really what I was going to talk about, was how in 2030 we can think more broadly about tackling those problems in an efficient way. And these are the types of learnings that we've taken from working in a small startup, so we're a team of 15 people, and we're very cross-functional. And I think that's probably kind of my first message would be what we need in the future in order to tackle big problems like climate change or gender equality or whatever it is. We need specialists sitting in cross-functional teams that are very collaborative. And I think the reason for that is because the problems we're facing are really interconnected. And I just take one example, and it's actually not related to climate change, but it's a good proxy for the type of issues that we are facing now, which are complex and bigger than kind of individual sectors or individual industries. So there's an example in conservation that we use around a drug called diclofenac, and in India, they give it to cows as an anti-inflammatory drug. And if the cows don't get better and they die, then the anti-inflammatory drug sits in the carcass of that cow. And then what happens is the vultures, who are obviously scavengers in India, come and they eat the carcass and they end up with diclofenac in their system. And so what that's resulted in is a big conservation problem, because in the 1980s we had 80 million vultures and now we have a couple of thousand. So over 20 years, or more than 30 years, we've seen a kind of 95% drop in the vulture population. So that starts off as a conservation problem. But then it very quickly becomes a healthcare problem. Because there's more carcasses lying around, there's an increased population of feral dogs. And in India, feral dogs often carry rabies, and there's a real shortage of anti-vaccine medicine, which means that the rabies cases shoot up to something like 30,000 a year in India. So then it becomes a healthcare problem. Then we introduce a religious problem. So the Parsi in India, the vultures are really sacred, so they want to store them in things called towers of silence, rather than burying or cremating them, which leads to an increased population of rats, which carry the plague, and crows, which infect poultry. So that becomes another healthcare problem and also an economic problem. Then you want to add a greater economic problem, which is the fact that more rabies cases creates £24 billion worth of healthcare cases a year in India. So there's serious weight on their healthcare system, which all started in a conservation issue. And then finally, the government in 2006 bans diclofenac and introduces another drug, which is slightly more expensive. But then they're selling the other drug on the black market, and we need social interventions to be able to change the way that people are thinking and acting on the ground, so it becomes a social issue. And that kind of connectedness of issues, my point is that we need cross-functional teams that can understand individual cases in extreme depth, but also work really collaboratively together in order to solve massive problems. And they're the types of problems that we're facing when it comes to climate change, because everything is interrelated, the kind of environment and social change. And I think for that, you need specialists, but you also need people that are really good at communicating. And I think people ask me a lot about software engineering, because we've got lots of software engineers, and that this is going to be the only job in the future is going to be coding. And obviously that's not true. On the one hand, you need a lot of people facilitating, so we need people helping other people work together. But as software engineers, the best software engineers are people, because I've never seen people meet so much as software engineers meet and discuss things. And I think we have a tendency to say, you know, we need data analysts and we need software engineers and we need people that can deal with people, but actually, you know, software engineers and people that are doing data and are doing this analysis and this research also need to come with those skills. And it's something that definitely has been underemphasized in the sector. And I think healthcare saw it with doctors, but we definitely have a real shortage of people in the software industry that have people skills. For those of us that are not specialists, and I would include myself in that, then you're a generalist, and the question is maybe, are you an executor or a facilitator? And if you're a facilitator, then maybe you can be a leader of the businesses that are kind of coming in the future. And I think then something to think about is about what's driving you. So if you're a leader and you're driven by purpose, then that's great, because you can build a purposeful startup that becomes a purposeful business and can kind of have purpose baked into its business model. But you then need to ask what's driving the people that are going to work for you and the jobs that you're going to create, which was kind of one of the topics today. And that might not always be purpose, because there's lots of people in the world and not everyone is driven by that. So I think, again, my point is that you need to think holistically about what you want to achieve and also how you're going to achieve it. So I get asked a lot, particularly by investors, actually, like people that are funding the startup, whether we want to be Greenpeace or whether we want to be BlackRock. And I really hope that by 2030 or by 2045, people are not still asking that question, because we need the Greenpeaces of this world to be running $16 trillion like BlackRock are. And so what I would really hate is for like university students or young professionals going into the world and saying, oh, you know, the private sector is awful, or the way that these companies are run are awful, because they're doing something really, really right. And we need to take the good in what they're doing and apply it to purposeful organizations. And I don't have the perfect answer to how to do that, but I definitely think that a ton of people going and saying, you know, we hate the kind of efficient, or these organizations that are in the city, they're run very efficiently and very productively, and we have a lot to learn from them, and we shouldn't just turn our back on the way that they affect the world. And I think on that as well, the question of collaboration is interesting, difficult. I think if you're a good collaborator, then that's really, really powerful in the future. We, as a startup, have really struggled to collaborate with the public sector. So we're limited by shares, and we move very, very quickly, and we have very little hierarchy. And that comes from being a small organization, for sure, and like running on Agile. But we've tried often to collaborate with NGOs, and we often do, and we really find that difficult. So the more we can merge those two types of organizations and bring them kind of closer together and bridge them, I think that will be really positive. We can start kind of collaborating on some of these interconnected issues. Yeah, and I think thinking about you know, your values and doing something that you love, that has been really important for me, and I think all of our team. As I said, not everyone is driven by purpose, and it feels obvious to me that that is what you would get out of bed for in the morning. But you know, I've got two co-founders, and one of them's definitely driven by money, and he's a great guy. But I think, you know, you need someone we need someone in our business who is thinking about how to make it sustainable and how to scale it and how to kind of reach millions of people by next year. And that's actually where our impact is going to come from as well. So that's also a really important part, and not just thinking, okay, I want to save the world, I'm going to kind of necessarily work for an NGO, or I'm going to do research. Like, we need to think about how we can apply it in a way that's sustainable and scalable. That's my piece.
That's great. Yeah, I think you raised some really pertinent points about making sure that we don't see anyone as the enemy, that we make sure that we use, you know, the current economic tools as a way to change those economic tools, to take the current business models, to shake things up, to create more entrepreneurs, and ultimately to use that for the benefit of tackling climate change, being more sustainable, and making sure you've always got a good accountant, I guess. Okay, next we'll hear from Dr. Simon Shackley. He's a climate science lecturer at the University of Edinburgh. He brings expertise in particular in the decarbonisation of the energy sector, which is massive for Scotland, and look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. Thanks for the invite, and great to see so many people here. I thought I'd just start with a story, because we run a program called Carbon Management at Masters, and we've been running it for 11 years now. We have about 400 graduates from the program, and we began an online program, so you can do it all online whilst in work, and that tends to attract people who do it over 2 or 3 years. And what's really interesting is, in the last year, maybe 2 years, but particularly the last year, I've noticed a really interesting development, which is that it used to be people like me, you know, with an environmental science kind of background and a long-term interest in sustainability, that were attracted to do our masters, the online or on campus. But now we're finding that, particularly for online, we're getting a whole new type of person who tends to be mid-career, so, you know, mid-30s, mid-40s, mid-50s, have worked in a completely different sector, but now are coming into climate change and carbon management, because they see actually this is actually the big problem that needs to be fixed in the next several decades. And I find that quite encouraging because, for example, one guy, he's spent his whole life in the city doing finance of telecoms projects. So his whole working life up to now has been how to finance telecoms. But he's got really interested in, well, how are we going to do this for infrastructure change around low carbon? And so he's bringing a whole expertise in finance and, like you were saying, these skills in the city, which are really valuable into this area. And it's really challenging for me, actually, because I'm finding that, he's asking really difficult questions about how is this costed, how would the economics of this work and how that, and I'm having to kind of reach out to friends in industry to try and come up with answers. But this is one example, but it's actually an increasingly number of people are coming into wanting to work in this area, and they may already be stumbled into it through work and they want a qualification, or it may be that they're making a deliberate shift. So they're using their master's as a way of a stepping stone into a new kind of career. And that's new. I haven't sort of seen this level of interest before, particularly from the city and from finance. So I think that's really interesting. In terms of where our students have gone in the last 10 years, I'd say about half of them tend to go into carbon consultancy of some sort. And that could be in a very large company like Ernst & Young or PwC, organisations like that offer various carbon consultancy services to companies. Tend to be large organisations and work in large teams, and they tend to be doing quite technical things to do with life cycle assessment, carbon footprinting, carbon accounting. But then we also have increasing numbers of people who are going into finance and investment, and there seems to be increasing demand for that capability as well from that sector. And so that's about half our cohort, and then the other half are sort of, that's a whole mixture of what the other half are doing. So it could be in the NGO sector, it could be we do have some startups, relatively few up to now actually, which is interesting. So it's hard to do startups, isn't it? So maybe that's not too surprising. But the other thing I've noticed as well in the last few years is also the increasing internationalization of the community who are attracted to do our program. And actually a lot of that demand's coming from China. And again, I find that really encouraging actually, because in terms of emissions, actually where the emissions have to really, China's going to be responsible for a very large percentage of the world's emissions. They already are. So actually the fact that we're able to actually get Chinese students to come in and actually get them understanding and working and thinking about all these issues and take that back to China. I mean, what we're not so good at is how do we maintain those links back to China? So how do we make sure that our alumni group can actually be working with us, and also how they can connect within China to actually try and make sure that learning is being used to its full potential. But that's, it's not just China, it's other countries, but China's by far the largest, but it's also Middle East, North Africa, South America, other parts of Asia. So in terms of what I see as being the sort of needs in a way, I'd sort of focus, I think, on two areas, which actually Teresa's covered to some extent. So I won't repeat what she said, but I mean, one of them I'd call institutional capabilities. So I think the whole raft of energy efficiency programs that we've seen over the last 40 years actually has been somewhat successful, but we actually need to step that up massively to get to net zero. And the only way that's going to happen is by improving our institutional capability, so our ability to work out what the design of programs, measures and policies, and how to implement them, and then how to evaluate and monitor and learn from experience. So I think there's a fantastic career option opening up here for people in this area, because there's going to be a massive demand. I mean, for example, private property owners and energy efficiency. How are we going to get progress on energy efficiency improvement in the private property sector? Really difficult challenge, but if we don't do it, we can't get to net zero. How do we get car users to stop using cars as much? How do we get people to stop using international flights for business or leisure? as much? How do we, as you mentioned, the issue about dietary change? So these are kind of really major issues that require this skill at designing effective programs, but also it requires engagement. So that's another thing I think is really lacking, is our capability to engage beyond the usual suspects. The usual stakeholders are ready to engage and they're good at it and they know how to do it. But actually we need to go way below the radar. We need to get to lots of communities for whom engagement's a bit of an alien concept. But we know it can be done. We've seen other examples where that's happened. But we need a whole new skill set. We need a whole new graft of people who have got that capability of understanding how to engage with different kinds of constituencies that have traditionally not been engaged with, and actually get them motivated and on board somehow.